The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Wooden benches creaked as spectators shifted in their seats, whispering among themselves. Papers shuffled, heels clicked on the polished floor, and all eyes turned toward the entrance as the defense attorney made his way inside. Marcus Hayes stepped through the heavy double doors with a steady stride. Dressed in a sharp gray suit, he carried a slim case of documents, his face calm and unreadable. He was young, but his reputation in the legal world was already formidable. Today, he wasn't just representing a client. He was representing the truth. Across the room, leaning casually against the prosecution table, was Officer Clayton. His police uniform was perfectly pressed, the badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. But the smirk on his face betrayed his arrogance. When he saw Marcus approach the defense table, Clayton chuckled audibly and leaned over to whisper to a fellow officer. "Look at this guy," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "They really sent him to argue this case? What a joke!" Marcus didn't react. He heard the words, but he refused to give them power. Instead, he set his documents neatly on the table, straightened his tie, and focused on his client sitting beside him. A young man wrongfully arrested in a case that exposed deeper corruption within the department. The bailiff's voice cut through the low hum of the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Sinclair." Everyone stood. The judge entered with an air of authority and took her seat at the bench. "You may be seated." As the room settled, Judge Sinclair scanned the docket. "Today we begin the preliminary hearing for Hayes versus City Police Department. Are counsel ready to proceed?" Marcus rose smoothly. "Yes, Your Honor." Across the aisle, the city's attorney gave a quick nod. "Ready for the prosecution." The judge gestured toward Marcus. "You may begin your opening statement." Marcus took a slow, deliberate step forward. His voice was calm, but carried through the entire courtroom with quiet strength. "Your Honor, members of the court, today we will expose the truth about what happened on the night of June 12th. We will show how an innocent man was targeted, falsely accused, and humiliated simply because it was easier than seeking real justice. And we will prove that the officer responsible for that injustice is sitting right here." He glanced briefly toward Clayton, who smirked and shook his head as if the words meant nothing. Marcus continued, laying out the timeline of the arrest, the lack of probable cause, and the inconsistencies in the officer's written report. Each sentence built toward the inevitable reveal. Clayton couldn't help himself. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a soft laugh. "He's really trying hard to make this sound serious," he whispered, loud enough for a few in the gallery to hear. But Marcus didn't falter. Instead, he calmly pressed a button on the evidence remote. The large courtroom screen flickered to life. On it played body cam footage from the night of the arrest, footage that directly contradicted Clayton's sworn statement. Gasps echoed through the room. Spectators leaned forward. Even the judge's expression shifted slightly as the footage showed exactly what Marcus had promised. Clayton had lied. Marcus turned to the jury box. His tone sharpened, still calm, but carrying undeniable weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence doesn't just speak, it screams. And it reveals that Officer Clayton's testimony is not only false, it's deliberately deceptive." Clayton's smug grin faded, his eyes narrowing as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. For the first time, the power in the room shifted, and Marcus Hayes was only getting started. The video played on, filling the silent courtroom with the sounds of that night. Clayton's voice barking orders, his tone harsh and dismissive, the confusion of Marcus's client trying to comply. It showed everything. No probable cause, no real justification for the arrest, just arrogance and abuse of power. When the footage ended, the room was so quiet you could hear someone exhale in the back row. Marcus stepped forward, holding a remote in one hand and a copy of Clayton's written statement in the other. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm, "this sworn testimony claims my client was resisting arrest, but the footage you just saw clearly shows otherwise. There was no resistance, only compliance. And yet, Officer Clayton still chose to falsify this report, knowing it could ruin an innocent man's life." Judge Sinclair leaned slightly forward, her expression unreadable but sharper now. She glanced down at the papers before her. "Officer Clayton, this is your report?" Clayton shifted in his seat, his earlier smugness replaced by visible discomfort. "Yes, Your Honor, but—" The judge cut him off. "It does not align with the evidence presented. Explain." Clayton cleared his throat. "The footage doesn't capture the full context of the situation." Things were moving fast. Marcus interjected, his tone still calm, but undeniably cutting. "Fast? Officer, this was a routine stop, and the video shows my client standing still, hands raised, clearly following every instruction you gave. What exactly was moving fast?" A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the spectators. Clayton's face flushed red. The judge tapped her pen lightly on the bench. "Counsel, proceed." Marcus nodded. "Your Honor, this is not just about one wrongful arrest. This is about a pattern, a mindset that says it's acceptable to mock, demean, and strip dignity from people simply because you can. And when that mindset wears a badge, it becomes dangerous." He turned to the jury, his gaze steady. No one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. And when the law is twisted by prejudice, the entire system suffers. That is why we are here today. Clayton leaned toward the city attorney, whispering furiously. But it was too late. The evidence was in the open, and the tide had turned. The judge glanced at the jury, then back at Marcus. "Do you have additional evidence to present?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, holding up another folder. "Testimony from 2 eyewitnesses, both of whom confirm my client was treated with hostility before any supposed incident occurred. They are present today and ready to testify." Clayton slumped slightly in his chair. His fellow officers avoided his gaze. Even the city attorney looked uneasy. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply handed the folder to the bailiff and returned to his table, his expression composed. Across the room, a young woman sitting in the gallery whispered to her neighbor, "Did you see the way that officer was laughing at him before? He thought this was a joke. Not anymore." As the judge called a brief recess, Clayton stood quickly, adjusting his uniform as if trying to reclaim some semblance of control. But when his eyes met Marcus's, there was no more mockery, only the realization that the truth had cornered him. Marcus quietly gathered his papers, not even sparing Clayton another glance. He didn't need to, because in that courtroom, the power had shifted, and it wasn't coming back. When the recess ended, the courtroom filled again with quiet murmurs. Spectators settled into their seats, whispering about what they'd just seen. The weight of the body cam footage still lingered in the air like an unspoken truth no one could ignore. Judge Sinclair returned to the bench, her expression firm. Court is back in session. Mr. Hayes, you may call your first witness. Marcus stood, buttoning his jacket with calm precision. Your Honor, I call Mrs. Eleanor Brooks to the stand. A middle-aged woman stepped forward nervously, clutching her purse. She was an eyewitness who had been at the scene the night of the arrest. As she took her oath and sat down, Marcus approached with a reassuring smile. Mrs. Brooks, Marcus began gently, can you please describe what you saw on the evening of June 12th? She nodded. I was walking my dog near the corner store. I saw a man, your client, standing outside. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Then a patrol car pulled up. Officer Clayton got out and he just started questioning him aggressively. The man looked confused, but he did everything he was told. He didn't resist, not once. And what happened after that? Marcus asked. Clayton shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Mrs. Brooks continued. Officer Clayton pushed him against the car and put him in handcuffs. I remember thinking it didn't make sense. The poor man kept saying he hadn't done anything. Marcus nodded. Did you see my client make any threats or attempt to harm the officer? No, she said firmly. He was calm the whole time. It was the officer who was shouting. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Marcus thanked Mrs. Brooks and stepped aside. The city attorney rose for cross-examination, but his questions were weak, almost hesitant. Mrs. Brooks's testimony was clear and consistent. By the time she stepped down, the jury's eyes were already telling the story. Doubt had shifted toward Clayton. Next, Marcus called the second witness, a store clerk who had also been present that night. His account mirrored Mrs. Brooks's word for word. When the clerk finished, Marcus walked back to his table, pausing only to glance briefly at Clayton. Your Honor, Marcus said, these witnesses confirm what the video already proved. My client was not resisting. The arrest was unjustified, and the officer knowingly falsified his report. Clayton's face was flushed now, his jaw tight. He leaned toward the city attorney again, but the attorney simply stared down at the desk, clearly aware the case was slipping through his fingers. Judge Sinclair adjusted her glasses and turned to Clayton. Officer, this is serious. Are you prepared to testify under oath to the accuracy of your report? Clayton stood slowly. Your Honor, my recollection of events may have been, Marcus cut in smoothly, falsified or simply convenient. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Order, the judge barked, silencing the room. She turned her sharp gaze to Clayton. I will remind you that perjury is a crime, officer. Think carefully before you answer. Clayton swallowed hard, his confidence visibly crumbling. Marcus returned to his table, his expression calm and focused. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the evidence to hang in the room. The judge finally spoke. We will reconvene tomorrow for further testimony. Until then, Officer Clayton, I suggest you consult with your counsel very carefully. As everyone stood to leave, Clayton avoided Marcus's gaze entirely. Meanwhile, Marcus calmly gathered his files and turned to his client. We're closer than they think. The truth is already on our side. The client nodded, relief softening his face. And for Clayton, the once arrogant smirk was gone. For the first time, he understood he was no longer in control, son. The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. News of the explosive evidence had spread, and now curious onlookers, journalists, and community activists filled the benches. The air buzzed with anticipation. Marcus arrived early, as always, his case files neatly organized under his arm. He exchanged quiet words with his client, who looked both nervous and hopeful. Across the aisle, Officer Clayton sat stiffly at the defense table. The smugness that once defined his posture was gone, replaced with a tight-lipped tension. When Judge Sinclair entered, the room fell silent. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The judge looked directly at Clayton. "Officer, you've had time to review the evidence against your initial report. I strongly advise you to consider your next statement carefully." Clayton shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His attorney leaned over, whispering urgently. Whatever they said didn't bring him comfort. His face stayed pale, his jaw clenched. Marcus rose smoothly. "Your Honor, the plaintiff requests that Officer Clayton take the stand today. His testimony will be essential to clarify the discrepancies between his written report and the body camera footage." Judge Sinclair nodded. "Very well. Officer Clayton, take the stand." Clayton hesitated, but had no choice. He walked to the witness box, his steps heavy. After being sworn in, Marcus approached him with measured calm. "Officer Clayton," Marcus began, "you stated in your report that my client resisted arrest, correct?" "Yes," Clayton said quietly. "And yet the footage we all viewed yesterday shows my client standing still, hands raised, offering no resistance. Is that correct?" Clayton avoided his gaze. "Yes, Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "So your sworn statement was false?" Clayton opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence in the room was deafening. "Officer, answer the question," Judge Sinclair pressed. Finally, Clayton muttered, "Yes, I exaggerated the situation." A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. Marcus stepped closer, his tone sharpening. "You didn't just exaggerate, officer. You knowingly filed a false report that could have destroyed an innocent man's life. Why?" Clayton's face reddened. "I thought he looked suspicious. He was—" Marcus cut him off. "He was what? Standing quietly outside a store? Is that what looked suspicious to you, or was it just who he is?" The courtroom gasped. Clayton stammered, "That's not what I meant." Marcus turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this isn't just negligence. This is deliberate misconduct. An officer of the law mocked and humiliated a citizen, then lied under oath to justify it. And the evidence is undeniable." Judge Sinclair's expression hardened. "Officer Clayton, perjury and abuse of authority are serious offenses. You will answer for them." Clayton sank back into the witness box, visibly defeated. His attorney looked equally drained, knowing the case was slipping beyond saving. Marcus calmly returned to his table. The power in the room now firmly shifted. He didn't look at Clayton again. There was no need. The truth had already spoken louder than any insult ever could. The judge addressed the court. "We will proceed with closing statements this afternoon. In light of this testimony and the evidence presented, the court will also consider disciplinary action against Officer Clayton beyond this trial." As the gavel struck for recess, Clayton stepped down from the stand, his shoulders slumped. Marcus leaned toward his client. "We've reached the turning point. Justice is on our side now." And for the first time since the trial began, his client exhaled with relief, a glimmer of hope finally replacing the fear in his eyes. When the recess ended, the crowd returned with even more energy than before. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The gallery was filled to capacity, People leaning forward, whispering quietly, waiting for the moment the gavel would strike again. Judge Sinclair entered, and the room fell silent instantly. "Court is back in session," the bailiff announced. Clayton sat back at the defense table, visibly shaken. His uniform no longer felt like a shield. The badge on his chest seemed heavier than ever, no longer a symbol of authority, but a reminder of his betrayal of it. Marcus rose slowly, his presence controlled but commanding. "Your Honor," he began, "in light of the officer's own admission of perjury, I request immediate consideration of disciplinary actions while this case proceeds toward judgment." The judge looked at the city attorney. "Counsel, do you have anything to add?" The attorney cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor, the department acknowledges the evidence in the officer's statement. We all cannot dispute the facts presented." The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. "Very well. I will decide on sanctions after hearing closing arguments. Mr. Hayes, you may proceed." Marcus turned to the jury, his voice calm but resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the truth with your own eyes. You've heard the officer's words. My client did nothing wrong, yet he was treated like a criminal. Officer Clayton's actions were not just careless, they were intentional. He mocked an innocent man, lied about it in an official report, and expected no one to challenge him." He paused, letting his words settle. "This isn't about one bad arrest. It's about what happens when those with power believe they're untouchable. But the law is supposed to protect all of us. And today, it must protect my client." Marcus stepped back, his gaze never wavering. The city attorney stood reluctantly. His closing statement was brief, almost hollow. "We acknowledge errors were made. We ask the court to consider the context, but we understand the gravity of the situation." When the statements ended, Judge Sinclair leaned forward. Her tone was sharp and deliberate. "This court finds that Officer Clayton knowingly falsified a report, perjured himself under oath, and abused his authority. Such behavior cannot be tolerated in any capacity. Effective immediately, Officer Clayton is suspended without pay, pending further disciplinary hearings by the department. Furthermore, this court will be forwarding all evidence to the district attorney for review of potential criminal charges." A stunned silence filled the room, followed by a wave of murmurs. Clayton's face drained of color. He tried to stand, but the bailiff gestured for him to remain seated. His attorney whispered something, but Clayton barely heard it. All he could focus on was the gavel striking the bench. Sharp. Final. "Court is adjourned," Judge Sinclair said firmly. Marcus turned to his client, who looked overwhelmed with relief. "It's over," Marcus said softly. "You're free." The client nodded, eyes misting. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. You saved my life." As they gathered their things, Marcus glanced across the room one last time. Clayton was still seated, staring at nothing, the weight of what had just happened finally sinking in. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply walked out of the courtroom, his calm composure the ultimate answer to all the mockery he'd endured. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions, but Marcus kept moving. Because true justice didn't need a spectacle. It simply needed to be done. Outside the courthouse, the midday sun glared down as people spilled onto the steps, buzzing with conversations about what they had just witnessed. Spectators pulled out phones, sending messages and posting online. In a matter of hours, Clayton's downfall would become the headline of every local news outlet. Marcus and his client exited quietly, avoiding the growing crowd of reporters clustered at the entrance. Flashes popped as journalists shouted questions. "Mr. Hayes, how does it feel to win such a high-profile case? Do you think the department will take wider action after this?" Marcus raised a hand gently, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here for sound bites. Today was about justice for my client. That's all that matters." He guided his client through the crowd, away from the chaos, toward a quiet corner of the plaza. There, the man stopped, taking a deep breath like someone who had been holding it for months. "Marcus, I don't even know what to say," he murmured. "I thought my life was over. You gave me my dignity back." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You never lost your dignity. It was taken from you. Today we just made sure they had to give it back." Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Clayton remained seated long after the gallery had emptied. The weight of the judge's words pressed down on him like a stone, suspended without pay, facing possible criminal charges, and worst of all, stripped of the authority he had once wielded carelessly. The bailiff finally approached. "You have to leave now, officer. Or should I say, Mr. Clayton." Clayton flinched at the title. Without his badge, without his uniform, who was he? As he walked out of the courtroom, the reporters outside swarmed him, firing off harsh questions. "Do you have anything to say about lying under oath? Are you worried about losing your badge permanently?" Clayton kept his head down, pushing through the crowd silently. For the first time, he felt exposed, powerless, and very small. Across town, at Marcus's law office, his client sat with family members who had come to thank him. The mood was warm, filled with gratitude. "You didn't just fight for me," the client said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You fought for everyone like me who doesn't have a voice." Marcus smiled faintly. That's the point of the law. It should protect, not destroy. And sometimes it needs a reminder of what it's meant to do. Back at the police department, Clayton was called into an emergency meeting with his superiors. The chief looked at him with deep disappointment. "You put this entire department under scrutiny," the chief said coldly. "Your actions don't just reflect on you. They reflect on all of us. We can't protect someone who lies under oath. Turn in your badge." Clayton hesitated, but the chief's stare left no room for argument. Slowly, he unpinned the badge from his uniform and set it on the table. It made a small metallic sound that felt louder than anything in the room. When he walked out of the precinct for the last time, the uniform that once made him feel untouchable felt like a heavy costume he no longer deserved to wear. Meanwhile, Marcus sat alone in his office after everyone left, sipping coffee as the evening sun filtered through the blinds. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't angry. He was simply reflecting. The fight was never about humiliating one man. It was about exposing the truth and letting the truth speak for itself. And in this case, it had spoken louder than anyone's arrogance ever could. By evening, the courthouse footage had already made its way onto the evening news. Clips of Marcus presenting the body cam evidence and Clayton admitting he falsified his report replayed over and over. Anchors dissected every detail. Commentators debated the broader implications, and social media exploded with reactions. At home, Clayton sat in his dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the TV. His own face stared back at him from the news report. Uniform crisp, expression caught somewhere between arrogance and fear. Officer Clayton has been suspended without pay and faces possible charges for perjury and misconduct, the reporter said. The department released a statement promising full cooperation with the investigation. Clayton turned off the television abruptly, the silence pressing in around him. For years, his badge had been his shield, his power, his identity. Without it, he felt hollow, and for the first time, he had no one to blame but himself. Meanwhile, Marcus stayed late at his office. The lights from the city glowed outside his window as he reviewed the final paperwork to formally close his client's case. The victory was clear, but Marcus didn't linger on triumph. He knew tomorrow would bring another case, another fight for someone who needed it. His client returned briefly to thank him once more before leaving with his family. "You showed me that the law can still work for people like me," the man said. "You gave me hope again." Marcus smiled faintly. "That's what justice is supposed to do. Take care of yourself, and don't let this moment define you. It's behind you now." The man left, his shoulders lighter than they had been in months. Across town, Clayton's phone buzzed endlessly with messages. Some from former colleagues distancing themselves, others from reporters looking for statements. He ignored them all. His inbox was already filling with notices. Internal affairs scheduling hearings, union representatives demanding meetings, and a formal letter summoning him for disciplinary proceedings. The once proud officer now felt like a stranger in his own life. At the police department, the chief held a press conference, publicly addressing the scandal. "Our department takes integrity seriously," he told the cameras. "Officer Clayton's actions do not reflect the values we uphold. He will be held accountable for his misconduct." The department was already bracing for lawsuits, internal audits, and the fallout of public scrutiny. Clayton's single act of arrogance had opened a much larger wound. Meanwhile, Marcus quietly returned home. He poured himself a glass of water, sat by the window, and looked out at the city skyline. There were no cameras on him, no applause, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth had been brought into the light. He thought of the courtroom that morning, Clayton's mocking laughter, his careless dismissal of Marcus's presence. And then he thought of the silence that had filled the room when the evidence played, when the arrogance cracked and the truth came crashing through. Marcus didn't need revenge. He didn't need to see Clayton destroyed. What mattered was that justice had been done, not just for his client, but as a reminder to anyone who thought power gave them the right to disrespect others. And as the city slept, the story continued to ripple outward, changing the way people talked about the law, about accountability, about dignity. For Clayton, it was the beginning of a long fall he couldn't stop. For Marcus, it was just another step forward, proof that quiet persistence can move mountains. Because real power isn't loud or boastful. It simply stands firm, lets the truth do its work, and leaves its mark on everyone who witnesses it. The next morning, the headlines were impossible to miss. Newspapers, online articles, and TV broadcasts all carried the same story. Officer suspended after courtroom bombshell. Black lawyer exposes false arrest. Photos from the trial showed Marcus standing calmly with his client, while Clayton appeared hunched on the witness stand, his confidence shattered. At the precinct, officers read the news silently over their morning coffee. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered about how it was only a matter of time. A few were openly angry, not at Marcus, but at Clayton. "He made all of us look bad," one officer said quietly. "Lying under oath? That's a stain on the whole badge." Meanwhile, Clayton arrived at the department for what would be one of his last official appearances. He had to surrender department-issued equipment and attend a disciplinary hearing. As he walked through the halls, colleagues avoided his gaze. He was no longer the loud, self-assured officer who once laughed in courtrooms. He was just a man stripped of the uniform that had given him false power. In the hearing room, the chief didn't mince words. "Clayton," he said sharply, "your actions embarrassed this department and violated everything we're supposed to stand for. You'll face termination, and the district attorney is reviewing charges for perjury." Clayton tried to respond, but the chief raised a hand. "Don't bother. You had your chance in that courtroom." Clayton left the room with the weight of finality pressing on his shoulders. Across the city, Marcus was already working on his next case, but the phone at his law office wouldn't stop ringing. Community leaders wanting to thank him, news outlets requesting interviews, other clients seeking his help. A young law student even showed up at his office, waiting nervously in the lobby. "Mr. Hayes?" the student asked timidly. "I just wanted to say, what you did in that courtroom inspired me. I want to fight for justice like that one day." Marcus smiled faintly. "Then remember this. It's not about winning for yourself. It's about standing up for those who can't stand up alone. If you keep that in your heart, you'll never lose sight of why you're here." Meanwhile, the man Marcus defended was finally free to return to his life. He visited the law office one last time to sign the final paperwork. "You didn't just clear my name," he told Marcus. "You gave me back my peace. I'll never forget that." Marcus nodded. "You didn't deserve what happened to you. Now you can move forward without that shadow over you." Back in his small apartment, Clayton stared at the badge lying on his table. It no longer belonged to him. The thing he had once used as a symbol of superiority now felt meaningless. The silence of the room was suffocating. He realized, too late, that a single moment of arrogance had unraveled his entire career. That evening, Marcus walked past the courthouse after hours. It was quiet, the large steps empty. He paused for a moment, looking up at the building where the truth had come to light. He didn't feel triumph. He felt clarity. The fight had never been about humiliating Clayton. It had been about holding him accountable, about making sure no one else had to endure what Marcus's client went through. In a moment, as the city lights flickered on, Marcus turned and walked away, ready for whatever came next. Because real justice doesn't end with one case. It keeps moving, quietly but powerfully, changing lives one truth at a time. Within days, the case became more than just a courtroom story. It turned into a conversation across the entire city. Community meetings were organized. Activists used Marcus's win as an example of why accountability matters. Even the local news shifted focus from the scandal itself to the broader issue of trust between law enforcement and the people they served. At a small community center in the heart of the city, Marcus was invited to speak to a group of residents. Parents, students, and even retired judges gathered to hear from the lawyer who had stood so calmly in the face of arrogance and turned the tide with nothing but the truth. Justice isn't a single moment, Marcus told the room. It's not just about one bad officer or one case. It's about building a system that values dignity over ego, facts over power, and truth over fear. What happened in that courtroom wasn't a victory for me. It was a reminder that no one is untouchable when the truth is on your side. The room erupted in quiet applause. Some nodded. Others whispered, "He's right." Meanwhile, Clayton kept his curtains drawn at home. The calls from reporters had stopped. Now it was just silence. Neighbors avoided him. Former colleagues who once laughed at his jokes now pretended they didn't know him. His pride, once built on the false comfort of authority, had crumbled completely. He scrolled through social media, seeing headlines about himself paired with words like disgraced, perjury, and terminated. The comments stung even more. Another cop thinking he's above the law. Good. He deserved it. About time someone stood up to him. Each word chipped away at what little defense he had left. Back at Marcus's office, the client returned for one final meeting. He brought his young daughter with him this time. "This is the man who helped Daddy," he told her. The little girl smiled shyly and said, "Thank you." Marcus crouched down to her level. "Your dad was always innocent. We just made sure everyone else knew it too." The client shook Marcus's hand firmly. "You didn't just clear my name. You showed me there are still people who care about what's right." Marcus nodded. "That's what the law is supposed to do. Protect the truth." Meanwhile, the police department held a mandatory meeting for all officers. The chief stood at the front of the room, his tone stern. "Clayton's actions cost this department its reputation. Let this be a lesson. If you misuse your power, you will be exposed. You will be held accountable. This is a turning point for all of us." Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but others nodded in agreement. Quietly, the culture was beginning to shift. That evening, Marcus walked through the courthouse steps on his way home. It was quiet, the day's cases finished, the building almost empty. He stopped for a moment, looking up at the tall columns, remembering the exact moment the courtroom fell silent as the truth played out on that screen. It wasn't about winning. It was about reminding people, judges, juries, officers, and citizens alike, that truth has a way of breaking through, no matter how buried it seems. Across town, Clayton sat in his empty apartment, staring at the badge he could no longer wear. He thought about Marcus's calm eyes in that courtroom, how he'd said nothing cruel, even after exposing the lies. And for the first time, Clayton felt the weight of what he'd done, not just to himself, but to every person he'd wronged along the way. Because sometimes losing your badge isn't the real punishment. Living with the truth is. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the courtroom case continued to spread. Local news outlets ran deeper stories on misconduct within the department, uncovering other instances where complaints had been buried. Community groups began pushing for independent oversight. What had started as one case was now sparking broader reform conversations across the city. Marcus was invited to a televised panel discussion about the case. He sat under bright studio lights with other legal experts and community leaders. The host turned to him. "Mr. Hayes, you handled this case with remarkable calm. What message do you think this sends?" Marcus spoke slowly, thoughtfully. "It shows that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to be revealed. But it also reminds us that this isn't about one bad officer. It's about a system that allows bias and arrogance to go unchecked. If we don't address the culture behind it, we'll keep seeing more cases like this. Viewers at home watched as Marcus explained the importance of accountability, not with anger, but with quiet conviction. His words resonated because they came from someone who had seen both the injustice and the path to justice firsthand. Meanwhile, Clayton's world continued to shrink. He had been officially terminated from the department. Internal Affairs had completed their investigation and forwarded his case to the district attorney for potential perjury charges. Without his badge, Clayton found himself facing the very system he had once thought he controlled. Walking through his neighborhood, he felt the stares. Parents pulled their children closer. Old friends crossed the street rather than greet him. He was no longer an officer. He was a cautionary tale. Back at the precinct, officers who remained began mandatory ethics training. The chief addressed the room. Every time one of you abuses your power, it erases the trust hundreds of others have worked hard to build. If you wear this uniform, you have no room for lies. The community is watching, and they deserve better. Some officers looked uncomfortable, but others nodded in quiet agreement. Change, however slow, was starting. In the meantime, Marcus's client was finally able to return to a normal life. He dropped by Marcus's office one last time, this time without any paperwork or legal matters, just gratitude. "You gave me more than freedom," he said. "You gave me a chance to live without fear again." Marcus smiled softly. "You always deserved that. Sometimes the fight just takes longer than it should." Later that evening, Marcus walked through the courthouse plaza. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the marble steps. He paused for a moment, remembering the day the truth had silenced that entire courtroom. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about revealing what arrogance tried to hide. Across town, Clayton sat in his apartment, staring at a stack of unopened mail, legal notices, letters from the department, and hearing dates for his pending charges. He replayed the trial in his head over and over, remembering Marcus's calm presence. There had been no shouting, no personal attacks, just facts. And the facts had been enough to strip him of everything. For the first time, Clayton realized that Marcus hadn't just beaten him in court. He had shown him what real strength looked like. Because real strength doesn't mock, it doesn't lie, and it doesn't abuse power. It simply stands firm and lets the truth do the rest. In the weeks that followed, the case no longer felt like just one man's fight. It became a symbol. Newspapers ran op-eds about systemic accountability, and community leaders quoted Marcus's words about dignity and truth. For many, he wasn't just a lawyer who won a case. He was a reminder that calm persistence could dismantle even the most arrogant lies. At the city courthouse, officials announced the creation of an independent review board for police misconduct. Cameras flashed as the mayor spoke, promising stricter oversight. Standing quietly in the crowd was Marcus, not at the podium, not seeking attention, just there to witness the change his work had sparked. A reporter recognized him and approached. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "you've become the face of this reform. How do you feel about that?" Marcus gave a polite smile. "This isn't about me. It's about the people who deserve better. If this helps even one person, avoid what my client went through, then it's worth it. Meanwhile, Clayton faced his own reckoning. He was called into a final hearing at the DA's office. Sitting across from prosecutors, he listened as they laid out the charges: perjury, filing false reports, and misconduct. The words hit like blows, each one heavier than the last. "You thought your badge made you untouchable," one prosecutor said. "But the law applies to you too." Clayton didn't argue. He just stared at the table, realizing there was no defense left to make. Outside, former colleagues who once shared jokes with him avoided his eye. He had become a walking reminder of what happens when power is abused. Across town, Marcus met with a group of young law students who asked to hear his story firsthand. They sat in a lecture hall, notebooks open, eyes fixed on him. "Mr. Hayes," one student asked, "weren't you angry in that courtroom? Didn't you want to call him out right there in the moment?" Marcus paused thoughtfully. "Anger is easy," he said, "but it doesn't always change hearts. The truth does. My job wasn't to humiliate him. It was to make sure the truth was undeniable. And that's what made the difference." The students nodded quietly, taking in every word. Meanwhile, Clayton walked through his neighborhood in plain clothes. The same streets where people once nodded at him respectfully now felt hostile. He overheard whispers. "That's him, the one from the trial." He lied under oath. For the first time in his life, Clayton understood what it felt like to be judged instantly, with no chance to explain. At Marcus's office, his client stopped by with his daughter again. She handed Marcus a small drawing of a man in a suit standing in front of a courthouse. "That's you," she said shyly. Marcus smiled gently, kneeling to her level. "Thank you. I'll keep this as a reminder that doing the right thing matters." Later that evening, Marcus walked past the courthouse steps once more. The plaza was empty now, quiet, the way it always was after the chaos faded. He paused and looked up at the building, remembering how the truth had echoed in that room and silenced a man who thought he was untouchable. Across the city, Clayton sat in his small apartment, staring at the empty space where his badge used to hang. He realized that Marcus never needed to raise his voice, never needed revenge. His quiet strength had been enough to undo everything, because the truth doesn't shout. It simply stands, steady and unshaken, until everyone is forced to see it. Time moved forward, but the echoes of the trial remained. For the city, it became more than just a headline. It became a turning point. At town halls and community meetings, people referenced the case as proof that the system could still hold someone accountable, even someone in uniform. Marcus's name was now quietly respected in circles beyond the courthouse. Invitations flowed in from universities and legal organizations asking him to speak about integrity in the law. Though he agreed to some, he never sought the spotlight. His focus stayed on his clients, the ones whose voices were often overlooked. One afternoon, Marcus visited a local community center that had organized a legal clinic for residents who couldn't afford representation. He spoke to a group of people explaining their rights in plain language. "It's not about knowing every law," he told them. "It's about knowing that you matter. No badge, no title, no position gives anyone the right to take away your dignity." Meanwhile, Clayton's world continued to shrink. His hearing at the DA's office concluded with formal charges: perjury, and official misconduct. His lawyer told him the best he could hope for was a plea deal. The once proud officer, who used to laugh at defendants in court, now sat in the same hard chairs where many of them had sat, waiting for judgment. Walking through the city, he felt invisible, stripped of the authority he once believed was unshakable. Neighbors he'd known for years wouldn't meet his eye. A store clerk, who used to greet him warmly, gave a curt nod and walked away. He returned home to the silence of his small apartment, staring again at the empty space on his wall where his badge once hung. It had been more than a piece of metal. It was the identity he built his ego around. And now it was gone. At the same time, within the police department, reforms were quietly taking shape. Officers were now required to attend new ethics training sessions, with Marcus's case cited as an example. A slide in the training showed the words, "Authority is a responsibility, not a weapon." Back in the courtroom, Marcus continued his work. Another case, another client, someone else wrongfully accused, someone else silenced by a system too quick to judge. But Marcus approached it with the same calm strength, knowing that every victory, no matter how small, mattered. One afternoon, a young attorney stopped Marcus in the courthouse hallway. "I just want to say," she said nervously, "watching you in that trial reminded me why I wanted to practice law. You showed that justice doesn't have to be loud to be powerful." Marcus gave a small smile. "Remember that. The law is strongest when it speaks quietly but clearly." That evening, Marcus sat in his office looking at the drawing the little girl had given him standing in front of the courthouse. He placed it in a small frame on his desk, a reminder of why he fought these battles. Across the city, Clayton sat alone at a bar, nursing a drink. A news report about police reform played on the TV above the counter. His own case was mentioned briefly, just a footnote in a larger story about change. He looked down, realizing how quickly he had become irrelevant. Because in the end, the power he abused was temporary. But the truth Marcus revealed was permanent. And while Clayton faded into the background, Marcus's quiet resolve continued to inspire ripples of change long after the trial ended. The courthouse plaza had become a familiar meeting point for journalists and community activists. Even weeks after the verdict, people still gathered there to discuss the case, turning it into a symbol of what could happen when someone dared to challenge the system with evidence and composure. Marcus walked through the plaza quietly one afternoon. He overheard snippets of conversation. "That lawyer, what's his name? Hayes? He's the one who exposed that officer." "Yeah, he did it without screaming, without drama, just the facts. That's real power." Marcus didn't pause or acknowledge the words. He didn't need validation. His focus had already shifted to the next person who needed his help. Inside the courthouse that same day, Clayton was present for his own hearing. Now, dressed in a simple suit, he no longer resembled the confident officer he once was. The DA laid out the charges formally: 2 counts of perjury, 1 count of falsifying public records. Clayton sat there silently, realizing that the system he once thought worked only in his favor was now holding him to account. When the judge set his next court date, Clayton shuffled out of the building with his head low. No one was waiting for him, No reporters, no supporters, just silence. Back at Marcus's office, another client walked in. A young man wrongfully profiled by another officer in a different part of the city. He hesitated as he spoke, unsure if he could trust anyone. "I saw what you did in that other case," he said quietly. "If you can help me, I'll fight this. I can't do it alone." Marcus nodded. "You're not alone. We'll fight it together, yes." Meanwhile, at the police department, the ripple effects continued. Officers attended mandatory training sessions where Clayton's case was dissected as an example of what happens when integrity is lost. The younger officers listened carefully. The older ones sat quietly, perhaps realizing their own past actions wouldn't hold up under today's scrutiny. The chief addressed them bluntly. "If you think the badge makes you untouchable, think again. The community is watching, and they deserve better." Clayton's name had become synonymous with failure. Once whispered in admiration among certain circles of the department, it was now spoken only as a warning. That evening, Marcus attended a community forum where local residents shared their experiences with law enforcement. A woman stood up and said, "When I saw that case in the news, it gave me hope. It showed that someone out there is willing to hold them accountable." Marcus simply responded, "Hope is the first step. Change is the next, and it takes all of us to make sure it lasts." After the forum, a young boy approached Marcus shyly. "Are you the lawyer who got that man's dad out of trouble?" he asked. Marcus crouched down to meet his eyes. "Yes, I helped him. And one day, if you ever see something wrong, you can help someone too." The boy smiled and nodded. Across the city, Clayton sat alone at a bus stop, waiting for public transportation he once thought he was above. A group of officers drove past in a patrol car, their eyes avoiding his. He realized he wasn't just suspended anymore. He was erased from the world he once ruled. And as the city lights flickered on, Marcus walked home from the forum, briefcase in hand, ready for the next case. Because for him, it was never about one victory. It was about leaving a trail of truths strong enough to outlast any lie. The following week brought another wave of headlines. The city district attorney officially announced that Clayton would stand trial for perjury and falsifying official documents. News crews lined up outside the courthouse to capture the moment. The same man who had once walked through those doors with swagger now entered quietly, avoiding cameras, his head down. Inside, the arraignment was swift. Clayton stood before the judge in a plain suit, no badge, no uniform, nothing left of the authority he once flaunted. "How do you plead?" the judge asked. His voice was barely audible. "Guilty, Your Honor." A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom. There would be no drawn-out trial, no defiance. Clayton had surrendered to the reality he could no longer deny. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus was meeting with a new group of community leaders. They were forming an independent coalition to monitor police misconduct cases, and they wanted his expertise. "You showed the community that the law can still work," one organizer told him. "Now, we want to build on that momentum." Marcus nodded. Accountability isn't about one case or one officer. It has to be systemic. I'll help however I can. At the same time, in the police department's training room, new recruits sat through their first ethics lecture. On the screen, a slideshow highlighted Clayton's case, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Remember this, the instructor said. One lie, one abuse of power can destroy a career and the trust of an entire community. Never forget why you wear the badge. The recruits sat silently, some glancing at each other, realizing how serious those words were. Clayton, meanwhile, spent his days in near isolation. Calls from old friends stopped. Former colleagues refused to meet with him. Even the neighborhood where he once felt respected turned cold. At the grocery store, people whispered. At the gym, they looked away. And late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he would replay the moment in court when Marcus calmly pressed the button and the body cam footage appeared. That single moment had stripped him bare in front of the world. Marcus, however, wasn't thinking about Clayton. His focus stayed on his clients. One evening, he was in his office with a young mother who had been wrongfully evicted. She looked exhausted, holding her child close. "Can you help me?" she asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Marcus smiled gently. "Yes, we'll fight this together. You're not alone anymore." Later, as Marcus walked home under the fading city lights, he passed the courthouse steps again. He paused for a moment, looking at the empty benches outside. The building stood silent now, but it had seen so many truths forced into the light. Truths that reshaped lives, for better or worse. Across town, Clayton sat on a park bench with an envelope in his hands. It was his official notice of conviction and the terms of his probation. He stared at it for a long time, realizing this was the final nail in the coffin of the life he once had. And in that silence, he finally understood. His downfall wasn't because of Marcus's anger. It wasn't because of revenge. It was because of the quiet, undeniable power of truth. For Marcus, the day ended like any other, not in celebration, but in quiet resolve. He knew there would always be more battles, more clients who needed someone to believe in them. And as the night settled over the city, two men lived in opposite worlds, one rebuilding lives, the other picking up the pieces of his own. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers and still changes everything. Weeks passed, and the city slowly adjusted to the aftermath of the case. The courthouse that once buzzed with scandal returned to its routine rhythm. Yet, the name Marcus Hayes remained quietly spoken in conversations about justice and reform. At a university lecture hall, Marcus stood before a room full of aspiring law students. They listened intently as he shared insights from his experience. "Justice isn't about how loud you can be," Marcus said, his tone calm but deliberate. "It's about clarity. When you present the truth clearly, it has a way of dismantling even the strongest lies. You don't fight arrogance with arrogance. You fight it with facts, with composure, and with integrity." Hands shot up with questions. One student asked, "How did you stay so calm when that officer mocked you in court?" Marcus paused, because anger would have given him what he wanted. Staying calm let the truth do the work, and the truth is louder than any insult. Meanwhile, at the police department, a shift was taking place. Supervisors enforced stricter reporting policies. Officers now had mandatory de-escalation and ethics workshops. Clayton's case had become a permanent part of their training manual. an example of what happens when power is abused. Never forget, the instructor told the new recruits, pointing at Clayton's photo on the screen. This is what it looks like when you dishonor the badge. One lie can erase years of service. One moment of arrogance can end a career. Across town, Clayton lived in near anonymity. His trial was over, his sentence set. No jail time, but probation and a permanent stain on his record. He'd applied for jobs, but doors closed quickly when they saw his history. Walking through his old neighborhood, he passed by two officers on patrol. They didn't greet him. They didn't even acknowledge him. He was invisible now, an outcast in the very world he once thought he controlled. Late that evening, Clayton sat at his kitchen table with a stack of unpaid bills. The badge he once wore with pride lay in a drawer, collecting dust. For the first time, he understood that the uniform had never made him powerful. It had simply magnified who he already was. And now, stripped of it, there was nothing left to hide behind. Meanwhile, Marcus's office was busier than ever. People who once believed the system would never work for them now came forward, seeking his help. One afternoon, a father wrongfully accused of a minor crime sat across from Marcus, nervous but hopeful. "I saw what you did in that case with the officer," the man said. "If you could help him, maybe you can help me too." Marcus offered a reassuring smile. "We'll fight this. The truth will come out. It always does." After the man left, Marcus stood by the window, watching the city skyline glow under the evening sun. He thought about how far the impact of one case could reach. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the quiet reassurance that justice, though slow, could still prevail. And somewhere across that same city, Clayton sat in the dark, replaying the trial in his mind. He saw Marcus again in his thoughts, calm, composed, and unshaken, and realized that was the moment everything had changed. For Marcus, the fight would continue. For Clayton, the fall was permanent. Because the truth, once revealed, doesn't just expose lies, it rewrites the story entirely. The city had begun to change in subtle but noticeable ways. Community centers held workshops on civil rights. Town hall meetings were fuller than ever, with citizens speaking up, no longer afraid their voices would be ignored. And quietly, at the center of it all, was the case Marcus had won. A case that showed people what accountability looked like. One afternoon, Marcus attended a community legal clinic. Residents lined up to ask questions, to seek advice, to find hope in a system they had once thought was stacked against them. A middle-aged woman approached him nervously. "I just wanted to say, what you did in that courtroom gave me courage. My son was treated unfairly by an officer, too. Before, I didn't think anyone would believe us. But now," Marcus smiled gently, "you're not alone anymore. We'll listen. We'll fight for him." Meanwhile, at the police precinct, the ripple effect continued. Officers were more careful with their reports. Supervisors doubled down on reviewing body cam footage. The words "Clayton case" had become shorthand for a warning. Don't cross that line, because the truth will come out. During a mandatory training session, a new recruit asked, "Is it really that serious? One bad report and your whole career is over?" The instructor nodded gravely. "Yes, because one lie can destroy trust that takes years to build." Remember, the badge doesn't protect you from consequences. It holds you to a higher standard. Across town, Clayton lived in silence. He walked past the courthouse occasionally, seeing the building that had once been his domain. Now it felt foreign, almost hostile. People recognized him sometimes, whispering or staring. He kept his head down, knowing there was no redemption in their eyes. He applied for private security work, but even there, his reputation followed him. "We can't hire you," they said. "It's not worth the risk." Each rejection made the walls close in tighter. Back in his office, Marcus was visited by the same law student who had spoken to him weeks earlier. She brought news of her internship with a civil rights organization. "You inspired me to do this," she told him. "Seeing you stay so calm, so focused, even while being mocked. It made me believe I can make a difference too." Marcus nodded. "Good. Always remember, it's not about proving someone wrong. It's about making sure what's right can't be ignored." Later that evening, Marcus took a walk through the courthouse plaza. The steps were empty, but he could almost hear echoes of that day. The gasps when the footage played, the silence when the lies collapsed, the sound of justice taking back the room. Meanwhile, Clayton sat in his dim apartment, staring at the envelope that held his final notice from the department. Permanently dismissed, no chance of reinstatement. He placed it on the table next to his badge, which now felt like nothing more than a relic of the arrogance he'd lost. He realized that Marcus hadn't needed to raise his voice or seek revenge. The quiet weight of truth had done all the work. For Marcus, life moved forward. New clients, new cases, new opportunities to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. For Clayton, time stood still. Because in the end, when the noise fades, only the truth remains, and it never forgets. Months passed, but the echoes of the case still lingered throughout the city. The courthouse steps that once saw protesters and reporters were quiet now, yet the changes it sparked were still unfolding. Marcus became a familiar figure at community events, not because he sought recognition, but because people trusted him. Parents asked him to speak at schools. Local leaders invited him to forums, and students looked to him as proof that quiet resilience could shake even the strongest walls. One evening, Marcus sat in a packed auditorium, addressing a group of high school students. "Sometimes you'll meet people who underestimate you," he told them, his voice steady. "They'll laugh, they'll mock, they'll doubt you. Don't waste your energy proving yourself to them. Prove yourself to yourself. Let your work, your truth, speak louder than their arrogance ever could." The room was silent, the students hanging on every word. Meanwhile, the police department had fully implemented new oversight policies. Every officer underwent regular reviews. Body cam footage was audited more strictly, and anonymous complaints were now taken seriously. Older officers grumbled about the changes, but the younger ones quietly embraced them, knowing the community's trust had to be rebuilt. Clayton, however, had no place in this new world. He lived quietly on the outskirts of the city, taking odd jobs for cash. His phone no longer rang with invitations or favors. The people who once respected his badge now avoided him entirely. One afternoon, he passed the courthouse on his way to a temporary gig. For a moment, he stopped, staring at the steps. He remembered the feeling of sitting on the witness stand, the room closing in as Marcus calmly dismantled his lies. It wasn't anger he felt now, it was shame, heavy and unrelenting. Inside the same courthouse, Marcus prepared for another case. This time, he was defending a teenager accused of a minor theft. The boy's family sat behind him, clearly overwhelmed. "Relax," Marcus told them softly. "We'll handle this. We'll make sure the truth is heard." In that moment, Marcus realized how much his work had grown beyond one courtroom victory. It wasn't just about cases anymore. It was about restoring faith in a system people had stopped believing in. After the hearing, a local journalist approached Marcus for a comment. "Do you ever think about Clayton?" she asked carefully. Marcus paused. "No," he said finally. "This was never about him. It was about the truth and the people who needed it to come to light." Meanwhile, Clayton sat in a small diner that evening, eating a silent meal. A news report played on the TV above the counter, covering a new police community initiative inspired by reforms after his case. Local attorney Marcus Hayes continues to work with the city on oversight policies, the reporter said. Clayton looked down at his plate, realizing how far apart their worlds had become. Back at Marcus's office, the little girl who once drew him a picture came to visit with her father. She handed Marcus another drawing, this time of a man standing beside a courthouse, holding hands with people around him. "This is you," she said with a bright smile, "helping everyone." Marcus smiled warmly, placing the drawing on his desk. "Thank you. That means a lot." As night fell over the city, Marcus walked home through the quiet streets. He wasn't thinking about victories or headlines. He was thinking about the small, steady ways change happens, case by case, person by person. And somewhere, miles away, Clayton sat alone in his dim apartment, realizing that losing his badge wasn't the worst punishment. Living with the memory of what he'd done was. Because the truth doesn't just win, it endures. By now, the case had settled into the city's collective memory as more than a scandal. It was a turning point. The reforms it sparked were no longer just promises, they were tangible. New oversight committees were active, and community members finally had a voice in how law enforcement operated. At one such community meeting, Marcus sat quietly in the back as residents spoke about their experiences. One elderly man stood up. "For years, I didn't trust this system," he said. "But what happened with that officer? And what that lawyer did? It showed me things can change. Slowly, but they can." Marcus didn't speak that night. He didn't need to. Just being there, listening, was enough. Meanwhile, Clayton's probation required him to attend community service sessions. His first assignment was at a neighborhood center, cleaning floors and organizing supplies. The same kind of community members he once dismissed now saw him mopping floors in silence. No one approached him. Some recognized him and simply turned away. At lunch, Clayton sat alone on a bench outside the center. A group of teenagers nearby whispered, "That's the guy who lied in court, right?" "Yeah, he used to be a cop." Clayton kept his head down. Every whisper was another reminder of how far he had fallen. Across town, Marcus was preparing another case in his office. His desk was lined with case files, evidence folders, and handwritten notes. His assistant brought in coffee and said, "The mayor's office called. They want you on the new advisory board for community justice reform." Marcus looked up. "Tell them I'll consider it, but only if it's not for show. I won't be part of a photo op." The assistant smiled. "They know you're not here for headlines. That's why they want you." Later that day, Marcus walked through the courthouse corridor on his way to another hearing. A young public defender approached him nervously. "Mr. Hayes, I just wanted to say you've been an inspiration to a lot of us starting out. The way you handled the Clayton case, it reminded us why we chose this work." Marcus gave a small, appreciative nod. "Stay focused on your clients. The rest will follow." Meanwhile, Clayton received a letter in the mail confirming his permanent disqualification from any future law enforcement positions. The paper felt heavier than it should have. He stared at it for a long time, realizing there was no going back. Not to the department, not to the life he once had. He thought of Marcus again, not angrily, but with a hollow sense of respect. In that courtroom, Marcus hadn't shouted. He hadn't gloated. He simply revealed the truth, and it had been enough to dismantle everything Clayton built on lies. That evening, Marcus attended a small dinner hosted by former clients and community leaders. It wasn't a celebration, just a quiet gathering of people who understood the importance of what had been done. "You don't realize how many lives you touched by winning that case," one community leader told him. Marcus smiled faintly. "It wasn't just me. It was the truth. All I did was give it a voice." As night fell, Marcus walked home through quiet streets, his mind already on the next case, the next person who needed to be heard. And miles away, Clayton sat in his dimly lit apartment, the badge he could no longer wear tucked away in a drawer. It wasn't the loss of his job that haunted him. It was knowing he had been undone by his own arrogance and by a man who didn't even need to raise his voice to defeat him. Because the truth doesn't just hold people accountable, it changes everything it touches. Months later, the city felt subtly different. At the precinct, officers moved with more caution, their actions more carefully weighed. Community liaisons now worked alongside law enforcement, bridging a gap that once felt impossible to close. The Clayton case had left a mark that couldn't be erased. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his work with quiet determination. He was now part of a small advisory board that reviewed cases of misconduct. He never sought praise for it. He simply wanted to ensure what happened to his client wouldn't happen again. One afternoon, Marcus visited a local high school for a career day event. Students crowded into the auditorium, curious about the man they'd seen on the news months earlier. "Being a lawyer isn't about winning arguments," Marcus told them, his voice calm and measured. "It's about protecting the truth. Sometimes that means standing alone. Sometimes it means standing quietly, even when others try to tear you down. But when you stand for what's right, you don't stand in vain." A student raised his hand. "How did it feel when that officer mocked you in court?" Marcus smiled faintly. "It didn't matter how he saw me. It mattered how I saw myself, and I knew the truth was on my side. That's what gave me strength." Across town, Clayton was finishing another day of mandatory community service. His task was repainting a vandalized community wall. As he worked silently, he noticed some of the people passing by. Parents walking children, seniors taking their afternoon strolls. A few recognized him. They didn't speak, but their eyes said enough. After his shift, Clayton walked past the courthouse where his downfall began. He paused at the steps, remembering the laughter he'd thrown at Marcus that day, the smug certainty that nothing could touch him. Now, those same steps felt like a monument to the consequences of his arrogance. Inside the courthouse, Marcus was finishing another case, this time for a family wrongfully evicted. As he exited, a fellow attorney approached him. "You've changed the way people see these cases," she said. "Judges listen differently now. Officers think twice. You've done more than win a case. You've shifted the conversation." Marcus gave a small nod. Change doesn't happen in one moment. It happens slowly, one truth at a time. Later that evening, Marcus attended a quiet dinner with his client from the Clayton case and his family. They laughed, shared stories, and for the first time, Marcus saw the man fully free of the fear that had followed him for months. "You gave me my life back," the man said softly. Marcus smiled. "No, you always had your life. We just reminded them it was yours to live." Meanwhile, Clayton sat alone in his small apartment. Bills piled up on the table. Job applications went unanswered. He glanced at the badge in the drawer one last time before closing it for good. It no longer represented pride. It was a relic of everything he'd lost. He realized Marcus hadn't just beaten him in court. He had shown him what true strength was, the kind that doesn't need to humiliate, doesn't need to shout, and doesn't need revenge. And for Marcus, life kept moving forward. More cases, more people to protect, more quiet truths to bring to light. For Clayton, time stayed still, a reminder that power built on lies always collapses in the end, because dignity, once revealed, leaves an imprint that can never be erased. The seasons changed, and the city slowly settled into a new rhythm. The reforms sparked by the Clayton case became part of daily life. Routine reviews, community forums, stricter oversight on officers' conduct. People spoke about accountability, not as an abstract concept, but as something real, something they'd witnessed with their own eyes. Marcus had moved on to new cases, but his name was still whispered with quiet respect in courtrooms and neighborhoods alike. He never let the past victory define him. It was just one of many battles in a career dedicated to defending those who couldn't defend themselves. One crisp morning, Marcus attended a small gathering at the community center. It was a celebration of new programs that offered free legal aid to low-income residents. The room was filled with families, students, and volunteers. A young boy approached Marcus shyly, tugging at his sleeve. "Are you the lawyer who helped that man when the police lied about him?" Marcus smiled and crouched down. "Yes, but it wasn't just me. It was the truth that helped him. I just made sure people listened." The boy nodded thoughtfully, as if storing the lesson for later. Meanwhile, Clayton's life had faded into quiet obscurity. His probation was nearly over, but it didn't change the reality he lived in now. No department would hire him. Old friends had moved on. Even his family kept their distance, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the headlines that told the truth. He spent his days doing odd jobs, living paycheck to paycheck. Every time he saw a patrol car pass, he felt a pang of something: regret, shame, or perhaps a longing for the life he had thrown away. But there was no going back. One afternoon, Clayton walked past the courthouse. He paused at the steps again, staring up at the towering building. He could still see it in his mind. The jury leaning forward, the judge's stern gaze, Marcus standing calmly, unshaken, as the body cam footage played. He realized the real punishment hadn't been losing the badge. It was knowing that his arrogance had been dismantled without a single raised voice. Just quiet, undeniable facts. Inside that same courthouse, Marcus was finishing another hearing. A young mother, wrongfully accused of fraud, had just been cleared. As she hugged her child in relief, she turned to Marcus, tears in her eyes. "You believed in me when no one else would," she said. Marcus gave her a small, reassuring smile. Everyone deserves someone to believe in them. As he left the courthouse, Marcus paused on the steps. The city stretched out before him, alive and moving. He knew there would always be more work to do, more people to defend, more truths to bring into the light. And across the plaza, unnoticed by the crowd, Clayton stood for a moment longer before turning away. He didn't approach Marcus. There was nothing left to say. Marcus didn't see him. He didn't need to. The story between them was already over, because in the end, dignity doesn't need an audience. It doesn't demand revenge. It simply stands, quiet, steady, and unshakable, until the truth is undeniable. Marcus walked away, ready for the next case. Clayton disappeared into the crowd, a reminder of what happens when you forget what the badge or any position of power truly means. And the city moved on, carrying the lesson with it. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, but its echo lasts forever.